get started. Good day, everyone. People are listening from different parts of the world. Someplace it's night, like in India, maybe it's early morning in USA. So our Critical Transitions in Complex System, or CTCS seminar series, is jointly hosted by IIT Madras in India and Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research in Germany. The seminar series brings together experts from fields such as climate science, neuroscience, fluid mechanics, combustion, etc., and aims to disseminate the state of the art in the prediction of critical transitions in these diverse fields of study. We have had really eminent speakers, stalwarts in the field, give talk here. We've been very fortunate with that. The seminar series typically takes place every month on the last Monday of the month, so please mark your calendars. And some housekeeping items. I request everyone to turn off their microphones except the speaker, and also use the Q&A box to ask the questions. We have ample time in the end to discuss the questions and clarifications. Now we'll give the floor to Professor Kutz, who will introduce the speaker.
Okay, yeah. Hello, all. I'm also very happy that we have our next seminar now today. It's really a very successful story, our series, I would say. And I'm especially happy to introduce the speaker today, this Professor Kira Rehfeld. I have known her several years because she was my PhD student a few years ago, not so long, a few years ago, was very successful. I enjoyed very much our joint work, especially on data analysis and paleo data, especially. Then she made a postdoc with Alfred Wegener Institute, then a postdoc in Cambridge. I think the main result of this was one Nature paper. But then she got the very prestigious Emmy Noether young research group and went to University of Heidelberg with this. And she developed already very strongly her group. And shortly afterwards, she got a full professorship at the University of Tübingen. It's also one of the universities of excellence in Germany. And she has now a very active group and is, of course, very active in various fields related to paleoclimate and other aspects, but also combining with modern methods of complex system science, and has papers not only in such journals as Nature Geoscience, and so, but also in the more specific and high-level journals in paleoclimatology as quaternary science reviews or something like this, and other climate journals. As it sees, you see that she is very productive and successful, and I'm very interested to listen to her talk on the latest results. Kira, you have the floor now, please.
Thank you very much, Jürgen, and thank you, Sujit and the others, for inviting me today. Yeah, it's my pleasure really to be here. So thank you for joining, so that I can tell you a little bit about, yeah, in a way, our journey, Jürgen, that we together started. Started maybe with my early work on ice cores, but then really going into data analysis, conceptual modeling, nonlinear dynamics, complex systems, recognizing how complex the climate system is. This is something that I think I attribute to the PhD time at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research with you. So what I want to talk about today is climate variability and how we now understand its scaling from the local to the global, but also from the short to the long timescales, as you will see. Throughout this talk, I will also refer to changes in climate variability depending on the Earth system state. And this is something I've illustrated here. So the three bubbles that you can see represent the world with ice on the poles. You can rest assured that in this world, on the left-hand side, ice would also be in the southern hemisphere. So with a lot of ice on the poles, this is I would refer to as a glacial state, similar to 21,000 years ago. Then reduced ice on the poles, This is what I would call the present day state. And finally, on the right-hand side, a world with very little or no ice. And what these three images represent are the last glacial maximum, as I told you, 21,000 years ago, the present day, which is warmer, and a hypothetical future state, if we arrive at removing through CO2 emissions and other emissions, warming and then thus removing ice on both poles, leading to sea level rise. So what I have here superimposed at the bottom are probability density functions for temperature in Greenland, which is what you see in the background, and the distributions for the last glacial maximum, centered around -50 degrees, and for the present day, or what we would call pre-industrial conditions, here at -30, so about 20 degrees warmer. These two distributions have they're very different maxima. Fair enough, that's what I mentioned, 20 degrees of warming. But they also have a very different width, so standard deviation. So the potential variance is fundamentally different that we've seen. And the question is, and this is what I'm going to try and answer over the next 35 minutes or so, is what we can learn from these changing probability distributions in the past for a warmer or maybe as warm as today future. So can we say whether climate variability will increase or decrease, for example? And so this change we reconstruct. For that we mostly use climate archives, Jürgen mentioned them. So for example, we have a speleothem record here, we have tree rings, we have lake sediments, ice cores, or loess deposits, from which we can take indirect information. On the other hand, we have climate models that we would like to constrain in their evolution. We would like to know, can they reproduce climate states that are fundamentally different from that we've seen today. And in order to really know that, we need good methods to compare what we see in paleoclimate archives and what we see in models. And we have to recognize that these two data sources are fairly different. Okay, somebody's raised their hand, but I'm gonna move that. Unless, if you can't hear me, then please let me know. So where am I today? I'm speaking to you from southern Germany, and so we have here a map of Europe. This is roughly Germany, and here this blob here in the bottom left, this is the city of Tübingen. So we're only 3 hours from Zurich, from the capital of Switzerland. If I want to go to Berlin at the moment, it takes me more like 8 hours. Due to train construction, but this is roughly where we're situated. This is a picture not from my office, unfortunately, but of the old town. I'm sitting here somewhere in the top right corner, where you can see it's a fairly old city and one of the older universities in Europe. This, however, and I'll just move this a little bit around, this is where I work. This is our campus. The pretty old town that you've just seen is down there in the valley. And this is the Geo and Environmental Research Center, newly constructed, just 4 years old. And Tübingen has a long tradition in the geosciences. So this is research going back to the evolution of land plants. It's evidenced here by these early organisms. Tübingen also remains accessible to us from our, let's say, lofty mountain campus. And it can feel like a mountain if you cycle up this hill in the morning. It has such a long tradition that it was also, at breaking barriers, also the first student, female student in the geosciences, or geo and environmental sciences, in Germany, completed first her studies in 1892, but also her PhD in 1895. think she also became one of the first university professors in Germany, Maria von Linden. So Tübingen University is fairly old, established in 1477. The motto of the university is Attempto, let's do it, let's try. And this is quite a refreshing motto, I think, for a university that is this old. We have 28,000 students. As Jürgen mentioned, it's an excellence university, of which there are 11 in Germany at the moment. It's a comprehensive university, which means you can study both exotic subjects, but also all the, not standard, but all the big fields like medical science, math, law. The research profile, so where the university also seeks to consolidate and further expand, is really in bio, geo, computer science, medical science. And yeah, in this context, we also ran national and international master's programs, such as the Applied Environmental Geoscience Masters. And this is really feeding into our perspective here as a department, but my personal perspective from the past of Tübingen University to the future. Now, if we take in the last 400 million years here in a logarithmic scale from A, B, C to D, with the deep past to the fairly distant future, 500 years into the future, we see that the radiative forcing due to atmospheric CO2 that can be potentially realized by humans equals that of what we've seen in the past. And this means that we can study the past using all our archives, as indicated in the beginning, check our models, for example, using indirect indicators such as oxygen isotopes, in order to then have more confidence for these models in projecting the response to CO2 concentrations as high as, say, in the Eocene 50 million years ago. The challenging aspect is that over these timescales, we go from a world dominated, for example, by dinosaurs, to an age of mammals, and now an age of humans. The Anthropocene era has not been recognized as a geologic epoch, but of course humans now are influencing almost every aspect of our land surface. Why then further go into the past? If you really look at now only the last 4 million years, and we look at what we know from temperature reconstruction, so this is from the Hadkrut dataset, we have good evidence for global mean surface temperature. This is shown here on the y-axis in Kelvin deviation to that averaged in the entire time period. Then we see that the 1.5 degree goal is approaching, and we see that in context to the rest of the Earth's evolution, our instrumental record is fairly short. So when we look at, and this is one climate model with an average climate sensitivity, so if we look at the response of the Earth system to warming let me just briefly go back, in response to pathways that put us on 2000 or 750 or less parts per million CO2, then we end up with potentially more than 10 degrees of warming above pre-industrial by the end of the 3rd century into this warming. So we would want to know, really what the impact of such warming is and how we could stabilize. The Earth has undergone transitions like this. So if we look into the closer past, the last 25,000 years, we've seen the deglaciation, so the change from the glacial period with a lot of ice, from one state into the Holocene state with far less ice. And zooming out in terms of time scale, we see that such transitions have occurred over much of the Pleistocene and were a lot more muted in the earlier time periods with less ice on Earth. So we can focus, for example, on individual warm periods in the Pliocene or on individual peaks in this temperature record to understand better what our how our climate is responding to large changes in boundary conditions in forcing, and to understand better how such large changes will impact different parts of the Earth system. So if you ask me to give, for example, reasons for paleoclimate research, then I would say one of those is pure system understanding. I think it's really amazing how over the Pleistocene the Earth tips into this states with a lot of ice, cooling, and then rids itself of the ice, warming, and it does so first at a 40,000, 41,000 year rhythm, and then at some point tips into a 100,000 year regime. And this is amazing, and this is a pattern emerging out of the complex dynamics that has not been fully resolved. We have limited ability to spontaneously simulate that with complex models that actually represent the physical processes. And so I think beauty and system understanding could be one reason to study this. The second one, and this is the one I've teasered a bit more earlier, is model evaluation. We're looking into a warm future. We might need to go back into warmer periods in the past, and we might need to take a good hard look at time periods where the system is warming rapidly to understand feedbacks, but also at time periods where the system is cooling transiently to understand stabilizing feedbacks. So this record offers us the opportunity to test the role of slow components, and it of course then provides context for future projections. Why does this matter at all? Because we have substantial sea level variability. And so from the present, where we have about 420 parts per million, we have by now, so this is from 2015, but by now we have 1.2 degrees of warming relative to the pre-industrial baseline, or 2014 is the baseline, and 20 parts per million CO2 more. So we have a sea level rise that is in the order of centimeters. But by the end of the century, it will be more. And if we look into these previous warm intervals that are also outlined here, but that I already indicated in the previous diagram, which had similar amounts of warming than today, and we know that we lost large parts of Greenland, some parts of Antarctica, or in the case of marine isotope stage 11, substantial parts of Greenland and small parts of Antarctica. For the Pliocene, we don't know if there was a Greenland ice sheet, and the upper level for the sea level rise that I've seen in the literature is above 50 meters. So these were individual studies, and how this relates then to global sea level rise is a bit uncertain, but it's definitely in the order of 10 meters or more. So warming on these timescales matters. It matters for our infrastructure, and it matters simply because a lot of cities are on the coast and people live there. Now, okay, so we have lots of reasons why we would want to project and understand and investigate past climate. What qualifies this? Why is it possibly so complex? Well, we've already seen from the previous time series that I've shown to you that the system is not stationary. It's complex, it exhibits all kinds of features of complex systems, and really it's a system of systems. You could fill an entire week of talks just with talks on one small part of this, just focusing on the ice sheet, or just focusing on the ocean, or on the deep Earth, or on the soils, on the biosphere, and then you could differentiate the animals and the plants, and whole talks could go into this. So it's a complex evolving system. It has many timescales. So if we, for the purpose of this talk, think about these timescales in thousands of years, so kiloyears, we have the deep Earth that evolves on slower timescales. But ice sheets, for example, traditionally are viewed as evolving on thousand-of-year timescales. So I put here 1 to 5 kiloyears. The atmosphere, of course, is much faster. We see changing weather patterns every day. So even a daily timescale doesn't cover it. We really have minutes, or if you look at small-scale turbulence around you, it's seconds. The orbital forcing, on the other hand, so the modulation of the true external forcing to the Earth system, operates on thousands of year timescales, so 21,000 years, 41, 100,000, 400,000 years. And these together combine to yield modulations of the energy balance over timescales of these glacial interglacial cycles. The change in the solar constant, or the change in the energy influx at shorter timescales, at 11-year periods, for example, is in the order of magnitude of 0.1 to 0.1%. So it's much, much smaller than that of the orbital timescale variations. Although the orbital timescale variations only change regional distribution of energy input and not the total energy into the system. Okay, so from this we already see the system has multiple timescales. It has different distribution. And if we want to model it, we really need to focus on individual compartments and think about what the real purpose then is if we want to model climate variability. So for example, looking into climate variability at interannual to centennial timescales, what we had available for a long time, is models that dynamically represent the ocean with full fluid dynamics or simplified equations. They represent the atmosphere dynamically. Quite often the carbon cycle is prognostic, so it's prescribed. It's not prognostic, it's prescribed. So we set a certain concentration for CO2 and other greenhouse gases. The ice sheets, their distribution and the amount of meltwater released from these ice sheets is prescribed, so it's fixed. It's not responding to the rest of the land. And at the same time, the land surface, so the amount of first order grass, trees, shrubs, is generally evolving, although there are now models where this is also going back. So these are general circulation models of the atmosphere and the ocean with dynamic vegetation that I would consider here, looking into climate variability. Luckily, we have tracers throughout the system that we can then compare the evolution, the simulated evolution of the model to. And this is the ice in the ice sheets, ice cores, marine sediments, same as lacustrine sediments and speleothems here. So by preserving information about climate and the environment in their layers to first order, we can reconstruct the climate. And this comes with its own set of challenges, but together we really see that understanding the climate system embedded in the Earth system and responding to external pressures, be it human-made or be it externally, like changes in solar luminosity or meteorites, is really an interdisciplinary challenge, and it's one where you start learning about a part of the system, and from there it snowballs. I'm hoping that at the end of my career I have understood parts of it better than I have today, and I think I'm learning every day. This is some part of the joy of being in earth sciences as a physicist. So what do we do? In my research group, starting from my Eminöter, young investigator group, but also now at Tübingen University, we ask really how are long and short timescales, weather and long-term changes and geology related? So together do they form this variability that is seen in the long-term record? And does this variability on shorter timescales depend on that, on the longer timescales? Is weather different if it's in the glacial from an interglacial, and can we find simplifying rules for that? So if we have a volcanic eruption, so this is number 3, is this volcanic eruption more efficient in a glacial period than in a warm period or not? Or is it the other way around? And based on this knowledge, can we suggest paths forward to mitigate global warming that are aspects on negative emissions, carbon dioxide removal, that are resilient to future climate variability? And we do this by looking into first order archives, so mostly speleothems. We have a lab here, ice cores, where we also study the oxygen isotope composition. We work with others who provide us with data from pollen that we can use to infer changes in vegetation distribution. Of course, we still work also with data analysis and modeling to bring this together. Because since we're asking global questions and questions about connections between timescales, we have to work with an integrative approach, bringing these different aspects together. One of those would not be sufficient. So I realized that it might be a bit difficult. Let me see the chat. It might be a bit difficult for you to raise your hand or now to have an interactive exchange, but I'd still want to give you the opportunity to form your expectations about climate variability before we talk about climate variability in the future. To give you the context, I'm going to discuss how Earth system dynamics in the past can be reconstructed and how we can identify what the true past climate variability is. What we do is we look into proxy records and into the models, and this is often a bit of a back and forth between people who work a lot with climate modeling and other people who work a lot with data. And how it's been often represented is with a soccer match where there are some people who prefer to work with data or generate data and others who model, and then you come together sometimes to talk about your research. And here we really want to, in our research group, want to go beyond this. Ice age in this context for the glacial period means we're looking at time periods where there's at least one permanent large ice sheet. So which means since Antarctica glaciated probably around 34 million years ago, this means in an ice age we've been for the last 34 million years, but we're really looking into, so what I'm asking you to think about is the last colder period than today, with more ice in contrast to our time period now with less ice. So what are your expectations? This is where I would say geography meets physics, chemistry, and biology, and the whole situation gets complex. What's your definition of climate? Does your definition of climate include its changes? Yes? No? Depending on, so if you hear the word climate, different mental images can come to mind. The classical definition, maybe you can recall it, but it's a change in the time period of 30, sometimes also 60 years, and it might or might not include the variability, so the change in indicators. If you think about climate variability, what do you expect as reasons for this? We already discussed all these long-term changes, so the change in the orbit, but there might be others. So for example, you might think of changing weather patterns, changing topography. After all, I talked about long timescales. Yes, we talked about changing CO2 concentrations and solar insolation, or maybe, or more likely, you thought all of these and a lot more. But this is not a given, because a lot of times what we conceive of as climate is means. On average, it's warmer in India than in Germany. That is absolutely clear, but also the amplitude of change over the course of one day is fundamentally different. So is the long-term variability. And how can we find out about this long-term variability? Depending on what you identify as fundamental reasons or hypothesize as fundamental reasons, we have to go to longer timescales or to higher resolution. We have to resolve better in space or not. So unfortunately, I can't hear your thoughts, but I'm hoping that this has given you some time to reflect on what you would now conceive of as climate variability, and we can use it in the discussion later on. Because what I define, or what I perceive as climate variability, can be illustrated with this image. We have here 40,000 years. We're now here on the far right, and this is from an iconic ice core, the North Group ice core, where over the cold period, the glacial period, up until the last glacial maximum, we have a lot of variability in the system. This indicator for this is an indicator for surface temperature in Greenland. So it's the oxygen isotope composition in this ice core that has been well replicated. So we know that large swings in surface climate in Greenland have occurred, up to 15 degrees of warming over 30 years in some of these events, the so-called Danskert-Oeschger events. And even at the last glacial maximum, so when glaciers in the northern hemisphere reached their maximum extent, and also the mountain glaciers reached their maximum extent, even then we have substantial variability recorded in the system. And by contrast with that, if we look into the Holocene, so at the end of which we're now sitting, we see far less variability. And this is what I define as change in climate variability. So not change in climate, that would be the change in the mean. The change in climate variability is really going from a state with a lot of variability to a state with far less variability. And we look at this now at timescales of centuries to millennia, and look into the data analysis, so looking into what actually other climate archives say, and into models where we simulated the world at 180 parts per million, going from these 180 to 280, and at the end of my talk I'll take you also to 400, 500 and 600 parts per million CO2. So what we did was dig out a lot of data from the literature and screening records. We selected those that had a good time resolution, that were published in reputed journals, had a good time resolution, so better than 225 years. They needed also to be long, so they needed to cover a substantial part of this 8,000-year interval that we selected of fairly stable conditions. We performed spectral analysis. Now, some of you might say, oh, this is linear. Yes, and there are good reasons for why we did spectral analysis. And we then focused on timescales of 500 to 1,750 years. because this is the perfect compromise between having enough records to actually being able to say something at the global scale, was at that time the perfect trade-off, and recognizing that the length of our stable interval of 8,000 years required us to make an upper level cutoff. So how did we translate this for climate archives that have very different resolution? We used the power spectra. So for a stationary stochastic process, for white noise, you would see a flat line reflecting the variance, but we don't have white noise, Gaussian noise, we actually have slightly red noise. So what you see here is in green, the spectrum of the Holocene, and in blue, the spectrum of, on the previous slide here. So in green, the spectrum of this segment, in blue of that segment. They've been both linearly detrended in order to remove the spurious long-term trends. And from the ratio between the two, we can get the change in variance from the cold period to the warm period. And as we can already see here, variance in the LGM in the glacial period is higher than in the Holocene, but some of you might say, well, we've seen that by eye as well. Sometimes it's not so clear for other climate archives and other regions as here. But this is basically the approach and how we detected this change in variance from the cold state to the warm state by forming the ratio over the variance in these two intervals. We tested this with surrogates, so forward simulating our data, adding also appropriate amounts of recording noise because our climate indicators are not perfect, until we were convinced that we were really receiving robust results with these methods. And the final result for the change in variance from the cold state to the warm state was that we find roughly a factor of 3 to 4 change. So the temperature variability at centennial to millennial timescales in the cold period is roughly 4 times higher than the temperature variability in our current warm state. So temperature variability reduced with warming. This is a figure that we got for these 99, or I should say 97 data sets that represent changes in surface temperature worldwide. Over here, however, we can plot the 3 Greenland ice cores that replicate the previous behavior. And so this way we could show that what was indicated in Greenland, what was recorded in the ice core, is not representative of what we see in the rest of the world. And if we then look into what the models are doing from short simulations, typically only 100 years, the models show very little change in interannual year-to-year variability under this state change. So you could say this is really because on the one hand we have multiple centuries, and on the other hand you have years, so this is not a fair comparison. And you're right, and quite some time, couple of months of computation time went into confirming that also with long simulations now running for thousands of years and really picking the grid box in Greenland, I would not find a similar change in variance as over the Greenland ice sheet, let alone replicate the global mean change in variability. So what we can take from it is that from the glacial to the interglacial to the warm period, temperature variability globally reduced at long time scales. It reduced by a factor of 4, which is much less than what was proposed previously, but it's still not captured by the climate it's not captured by the models that we have at hand at the moment. Models cannot capture this change in variability at millennial timescales. So where we now see further potential is to really look into this mismatch. And this is what we're doing, looking into high resolution terrestrial archives and really forward modeling the processes that affect the proxies. There are a lot of open questions from this. Where does this come from? So let's put ourselves into the perspective that this change in variability of a factor of 4 is roughly where we would want to end up. So we would need to boost the variability that is currently simulated in the models by a factor of roughly 10. Varies between factor of 5 to a factor of 100, depending on which timescale you look at, but as an order of magnitude, a factor of 10 is not wrong. So our models need 10 times roughly more variability. Why is it? Is it that the ocean is not integrating well enough the variability that we have at short timescales and the weather? This is the perspective that would come up from Hasselmann or co-authors. Or is this because the ocean itself becomes less stable in a cold period and acts as an independent source of variability? Or is it that the cold period is just really innately more sensitive to the existing natural forcing, for example, through volcanic eruptions or solar variability? The answer to these questions can potentially resolve this mismatch if we can find ways to fix the problem, but they also have implications for what we perceive as Earth system or climate sensitivity, so the degree of warming that we expect and the degree of climate variability that we expect in a warmer future. So what we can do is that we can look into patterns of state dependency and look into state-of-the-art models from cold to warm climates and look into variability that is simulated for surface temperature. And we can see they amplify in particular at the high altitudes and over the continents. So with a mean change, which is globally correlated for temperature, it's colder for cold conditions and warmer for warm conditions. And the variance change generally anti-correlated. Let's pick out, for example, South America here. South America in a cold climate saw reduced temperature variability, and in a warm climate, hypothetical future would see increasing climate variability. So the change in variance for South America is positively correlated to the mean change, and the same for the LGM. And this is different for precipitation, where we see it's anti-correlated. So a decrease in precipitation globally leads to a decrease in precipitation variability. And this is where temperature and precipitation fundamentally are opposed. In general, however, for both, we see that variability follows mean patterns. I'll skip over, it's a nice example that I have here, but I'll skip over the precipitation reconstruction from the sediment core. So this is something which you can read up in the paper of Mendes and co-authors, but we also see that the AMOC, so the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, plays a key role into this. And this is an example for how we can get closer to answering these previous questions. Now, looking into the timescale dependency and bringing together what I've shown you before, so this changing the individual bits and pieces, the timescales, the state dependency, and so on. The figure that I want to be able to update is illustrated here by J. Merrill Mitchell in 1976. This figure of the spectrum of climate, he drew it by hand, and basically as a conceptual figure for where we have variability in the system. So this is relative variance on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have the periods in years. And so where we want to go is that we can represent substantial parts of this graph with dynamical models where we have trust in their ability to simulate this. So we need weather models that actually can cover the weather to answer our question, but also a good understanding of long-term climate. So where we need the atmosphere, the ocean, but also we need the pedosphere and geologic evidence to know if the models are right. And in the middle is exactly where we see ourselves situated with this question of glacial to interglacial climate variability, where you need all the domains, you need a good handle on the boundary conditions and on the dynamics, and you are not able to rely on instruments to validate your models. And so this kind of spectrum has been proposed, for example, by Peter Heubers and co-authors for proxies, including scale breaks. At the moment, we are shortly before being able to confirm at which timescales models can also represent this kind of scaling spectrum. We know that it's not the spectrum, just briefly, it's not the spectrum that you've seen here, which is a flat spectrum with superimposed peaks. It's more a scaling spectrum. As a sneak preview, we have the last 2,000 years where we see we have a scaling and superimposed peaks of the diurnal cycle and the interannual cycle. And this is reconstructed from models and from data, both the regional spectrum here at the top, which has higher variability for the regions, and the global mean spectrum at the bottom, which shows lower variability where models and data agree well over these long time intervals. So we'll soon extend this to 2 million years. So why have I been talking about this discrepancy, or at what scales do we see that there is this large discrepancy? You've seen it here on the previous slide, the red curve or orange curve of the proxy reconstruction deviates from all the other blue curves here around the centennial timescale. And this is what you see here illustrated as well. So the timescales from interannual to millennial, and the spatial scales from the local to the global. And we see that blue dominates on the global scale. So agreement between models and data exists on almost all timescales at the global scale. If we go to the bottom row, to the local scale, and we see at the interannual timescale, so where we can constrain models fairly well with the evidence from the instrumental record, we have fairly good agreement, or we have agreement. But on the longer timescales, where we find it very difficult to have enough data and also to build the models, we see large disagreement in these studies. So this is something where we see that there is still a lot left to be done. We have to temporarily accept that we have multi-proxy agreement, which is why we think that the major problem is not on the climate indicator side, but we'd rather temporarily accept the hypothesis that models lack resolution, lack components, lack interactive processes and feedbacks. And with that, I'll briefly show you some impacts that we see into the future, looking from the last 24,000 years into 2300, because we don't have one model simulation going from the past to the future. We actually have quite a range. We've collected them together in a study where we compare the changes in surface temperature variability towards the end of the 3rd century in the future, and compare this to the last glacial maximum. And what we can see is that for this change, let me pick out here at the top, the change in temperature that we see, that is also indicated here. So from the last glacial maximum to the Holocene, there's substantial change in temperature variability, all statistical moments, so mean, variance, skewness, and kurtosis change. And they reflect changes in not only the mean, but also in changes of indicators such as sea ice, the equator to pole temperature gradient, which evolves differently from the between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. And we see that all of the models agree on warming, precipitation increase over these 24,000 years, with reductions in sea ice in response to the warming, But the models disagree on what exactly is the temperature at the last glacial maximum, what really is the symmetry of the hemispheres. If you look at the northern hemisphere temperature gradient and the southern hemisphere temperature gradient, there's quite a different evolution in different models. And what we see is that this has an impact, for example, on the skewness of the simulated distributions at interannual timescale, but also at centennial to millennial timescale. And it also imprints itself into the future. So looking from 2000 to 2300, these models show, some of them, quite a substantial change in precipitation that is then also in some case reflected into a general decrease in precipitation variability. And so this is how we are slowly approaching a state that we can really say we can compare past records to future simulations and past model simulations to past evidence of climate to understand projections and the impact of model parametrizations and model choices in the future. So the skewness, for example, in future projections increases substantially, potentially indicating an increase in precipitation extreme events. What is the consequences of missing out? The consequence is that we miss out on returns of extremes. So underestimating climate variability at longer timescales imprints itself on our on the level of climate extremes that we can expect into the future. So we require better models, we require better model systems, and we require probably communication and a better understanding of how to bridge this interface between the lack of variability or the lack of representation in some models, the robust results that we see, it's warming, and the more uncertain results, the degree of variability, and bringing this into society. So looking into how we can stabilize also the social systems. So we need innovation on pretty much all of these in order to understand these changes from the past to the future better. This is work that I have the pleasure to do with quite a few great people in my research group and collaborators that are listed here. I'll summarize briefly. I have shown you that we can reconstruct changes in the past, and we can also reconstruct the variability of this change. I've shown you that on long timescales, temperature variability reduces with the mean change, which implies that predictability should get better on long timescales. I've shown you that models do not capture appropriate levels of variability on these timescales. So these kind of mechanisms are not sufficiently represented, which means that we probably underestimate variance in projections, which implies that there are risks to mitigation targets which draw on present-day understanding and system state of environment, and could potentially imply underestimated ice sheet and sea level change. And finally, we can identify that also in the future there are systematic changes in the simulations when we have large change in the global mean temperature. But the challenge is here to control for the variation in model complexity, the different model versions, boundary conditions, and experimental designs. So this is something that still requires a lot of better understanding of the system and implications in order to get a good handle on this. And with that, I would say thank you to my funders, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you.